All right. Well, dear friends in Christ, grace to you and peace. Amen. We've been looking at biblical heroes who were major biblical heroes, people that you know, but also people who had major implosions or major failings or public sins, who were redeemed by the grace of God and given a second chance. And now we come to Samson this week. Most of us know a little bit about the story of Samson. We know about how Delilah cut his hair, made him lose his strength, and in one final act of defiance, he puts his arms on the pillars, and the whole house comes crashing down around him. We know that part of the story of Samson. We know that he was a strong man. In fact, legend has it that he was the strongest man who ever lived, and we like Samson because we admire strong people who seem to have it together, or strong people physically, or strong people who don't crumble in a crisis but remain calm, strong people who have things under control. I mean, strong people like Samson have characteristics that most of us admire. But with Samson, the problem is that while he was very strong physically, spiritually, he was bankrupt. He was a weakling spiritually. Physically, he was powerful. Spiritually, he was willy-nilly. Physically, he was the Rambo of the Old Testament. Spiritually, he was the Pee Wee Herman of the Old Testament. I mean, Samson morally was a wimp. Now, this morning we're going to look at some of the chapters in the Old Testament. Judges, the book of Judges. Samson only appears in Judges 13 through 16. We'll be looking at it a little bit more carefully in the adult forum. In chapter 13, 14, 15, 16 is the only place where Samson appears. Samson was born, and when he was born a child, it was during the time of the Judges, God chose him and God blessed him. Right from his birth, Samson was a godly child. He was born to a godly family. He was given God's blessing from an early time in life. He was physically, and at that point, he was spiritually strong. He had supernatural strength. He was probably voted in his high school class most likely to succeed. He had unlimited capabilities and potential. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, Samson, when he was a kid. Samson was raised in a godly home. He was dedicated to God as a baby. As a young man, when our kids are confirmed, he took a confirmation vow, a Nazirite vow, which meant complete and total dedication to God. He would never cut his hair. He would have a special diet. He would never touch anything that was dead. He didn't drink any alcohol. He took that Nazirite vow. He had everything going for him. But Samson rebelled when he was starting to get to be 16, 18, 20 years old, and he began to go his own way and do his own thing, and was so unaware of what was happening that literally, we'll see in a moment, he woke up one day and realized that he had lost it all, but by that time it was too late. Samson blew it. Samson blew and wasted his life. He lost it all not because he tried so hard, but because he didn't try. Samson is an Old Testament guy who was his own worst enemy. And what's fascinating to do is look at Samson, see the mistakes he made, and then see if there's ways in which we can avoid those same mistakes. So we're going to look at some points in the life of Samson in Judges 13 through 16. Three major mistakes he made, three major mistakes that we can avoid, three characteristics that he had that blew up his life that we can use to avoid to blow up and weaken our lives. And what I'd like to do is look at the life of Samson and the mistakes he made so that we too can learn about not making those same mistakes. Three mistakes I'd like to suggest that Samson made. His first mistake was that of self-indulgence. Samson's first mistake was a lack of control in undisciplined living. His first mistake was just loss of self-control and giving in to temptations. Now, temptations face all of us, and we'll talk more about that in the adult forum too, temptations that are left uncontrolled weaken us. When we give in to temptations and self-indulgence, it takes many forms. It might be alcohol, it might be money, it might be different kinds of addictions, it might be the way we handle our emotions or the way we manage our time. Anything that's left out of control in our lives, like it was with Samson, can weaken our lives. For Samson, his downfall was women. Samson had a terrible weakness for women. In fact, after his stellar upbringing in a godly home in Judges 13, the next chapter tells about, I'll read some words, Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman. That means that she was non-Jewish. She was outside of what they considered to be the family of God, another nation. And when he returned to his mom and dad, he said, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now go get her for me as a wife, is what he tells his mom and dad. That's his philosophy. Go get her, this foreign woman, for me. His mom and dad replied, Samson, isn't there an acceptable woman among your own relatives, among your own people? Must you go get an uncircumcised Philistine to be a wife? But Samson says to his father, get her for me, she's the right one for me. In Hebrew it means, get her for me because she pleases me. Undisciplined, uncontrolled. That's the way Samson lived his life. Undisciplined, out of control, focusing on himself and not being able to say no to temptations. The only thing that mattered to Samson was his own pleasures. He said, she pleases me, go get her for me. It didn't matter that God said, keep within the family of God. It does not matter that his parents said, can't you marry someone of your own kind? It didn't matter that he had taken a vow as a young man, as a Nazirite vow, not to marry a foreigner. Instead, he just self-indulgently said, I've got to have her. It's all about me. That was what Samson made a mistake. Just this one time. Give in to my pleasures. Give in to what I want. It can't hurt. It's just one time. It's one woman. It's a small thing. Just this once. It's no big deal. Besides, it pleases me. But as we see in Samson's life, as it begins to unfold more, his self-indulgent and giving in to only what he wanted was only his first mistake. Because his second mistake was that Samson, it's fascinating. We'll look at it in the adult forum, but read through Judges 13 through 16 this afternoon. Because the second mistake you see in Samson's life is that he lived in a constant state of anger and resentment. Samson was always upset about something, and he wasn't just upset, he reacted violently to people in a fit of rage, and his primary motivation was to get even and to get revenge. 13 is where he's born, takes the Nazirite vow. In chapter 14, Samson kills 30 men just for their clothes. He wanted their clothes, so he kills 30 men, burning with anger and resentment. In the next chapter, Samson seeks revenge on the Philistines. Now, granted, they were the enemy of his people, but he seeks revenge on some of the Philistines who did him wrong. They've done me wrong. I'm going to seek revenge on them. But this is right in the Bible. Goes out and catches 300 foxes, ties their tails together 2 by 2, and then fastens a torch with the foxes' tails 2 by 2, and let them loose in the grain fields of the Philistines, which burned all of their grains and their vineyards and their oil groves, all of their farming from which they made their money. A couple verses later, the Philistines are so angry about that they come to battle against him, and he starts fighting them in Judges 15. He takes the jawbone of a dead donkey and kills 1,000 of them. Remember that story? With the jawbone of a donkey, he kills 1,000 of them. Samson's life is out of control. He's in a dysfunctional cycle, hot-headed, angry, resentful, uncontrolled. Bitterness was weakening his life. Anger weakened his mind, and self-indulgence weakened his soul. He was in a deep pit, and he was still digging. Samson's third mistake was carelessness. His strength was from God, but he continually misused it and abused it. You know, he took the Nazirite vow in Judges 13. No alcohol, a special kind of diet, a vow not to cut his hair. But it was a way of saying, when he took that Nazirite vow, God, I am going to dedicate my life totally to you in everything I do and say. He had long hair. His strength did not come from his long hair. His strength came from his dedication to God. That was reflected in his long hair. His strength didn't come from his long hair, but his strength came when he said, God, as a kid, I'm going to be totally dedicated to you. The problem is that as Samson lived his life, he totally forgot his vows. He was a gamer, he was a playboy, he was careless. He toyed with temptation, wondering how close to the fire he could get, wondering how close to the edge of the cliff he could get without falling off, but he was careless. In fact, in Judges 13 and 14, it talks about the Spirit of God being mightily upon Samson. Isn't talked about in 15 and 16. The Spirit of God left him, as we'll see in a moment. The Spirit of God left him. In chapter 16, right before our lesson for today, we have the famous encounter with Delilah. Delilah was Samson's wife of the day, and one day the Philistines came to Delilah and said, if you find out the strength of your husband, we'll give you $1 million. And Delilah, being the treacherous person that she was, took the bait. So she tried to find out Samson's strength 4 times. In bed at night, she'd nag him, this is the word in the NRSV, she nagged him saying, Samson, tell me what your strength comes from. Samson answers 3 times. He said, well, if you put silky strands around my arms, that is where my strength comes from. Or you take fresh rope, or you braid my hair into 7 braids, that will make me lose my strength. 3 times she did that. 3 times the Philistines came in to get Samson. 3 times he broke out of the bows and the rope and everything and killed off the Philistines who were coming to get him. The 4th time, Delilah says, Samson, please, please tell me where you get your strength. And finally, Delilah got what she wanted. Here's what happens right before our first lesson for today. Having put Samson to sleep on her lap, she called a man to shave off, as he's sleeping, the 7 braids of his hair, and so he began to subdue him, and all his strength left him. Then she called out, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And Samson awoke from sleep and thought, I'll go out before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the strength of the Lord had left him. He did not know that the Lord had left him. One of the most tragic verses in the Bible. He was unaware of what was happening, unaware how his lifestyle was slowly and surely weakening him. He was so wrapped up in himself and his dysfunctional rebellion against God that he didn't see how it was weakening him. He gave up on his commitments, he gave up on his values, and worse, he gave up on God, because Samson made it all about himself. So, you know the story. The Philistines grabbed Samson. The scene quickly deteriorates. They gouged out his eyes. They brought him to Gaza. They bound him in bronze shackles and brought him to prison. The champion of Israel had now lost everything. Lost his power, lost his potential, lost his freedom, lost his influence, and it was all because of those excuses. Well, it's only a little thing. It'll open heaven once. growing away from God in this little step really doesn't matter very much. But those little things make a difference, like the mustard seed, like smiling, like the kids at school tomorrow or their families this afternoon. Samson had dedicated his life to God, but as he grew up, he grew away from God and was so full of himself that he didn't even think he needed God. The great thing is, though, that God never gave up on Samson. At the same time that Samson was doing his own thing, forgetting about God, the good news is that God never forgot about Samson. God was always willing to give Samson a second chance. In fact, in prison, as Samson was sitting there, his hair began to grow back. During that time in prison, Samson had a lot of time to reflect and think and say, God, I've blown it. I've made a mess of my life. Dear God, please give me a second chance. And Samson's hair began to grow, and his commitment to God began to be rekindled. That deeply covered spark of commitment in Samson began to flame within him, and he realized it's about God. It's not about my desires, but it's all about God. And that's where our first lesson begins. The Philistine took Samson into the pagan temple to make fun of him. They put him between two pillars, two columns. They didn't know that Samson had been praying, committing his life back to God, getting his life back on track as his hair began to grow. Samson prayed, as Steve read, Lord God, remember me and strengthen me just this once, O God. Just in my last effort, let me avenge my enemies. He began to push and strain with every ounce of muscle he could, and between those two pillars, and it was the biggest victory of his life, and that's why he's mentioned in Hebrews, in the Hebrews Hall of Faith. Hebrews 11, among with other heroes like Abraham and Noah and Moses. What I like about Samson is that Samson is the prodigal son of the Old Testament. Prodigal son in Luke 15, who goes and wastes his life, his inheritance on wine, women, and song, and then goes back to his father who has been waiting for him to give him a second chance. Samson is like the thief on the cross, who, next to Jesus, reflects on his life and says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, truly, I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Samson is one who shows us directly that if God can take Samson's life after he blew it in so many ways, if God can give him a second chance, God can certainly give any one of us a second chance and use us for God's good. But we don't have to make the same mistakes that Samson did. We don't have to get so far away from God as Samson did, as the prodigal son did, as the thief on the cross did. We can learn from Samson's three mistakes if we ask ourselves the questions that Samson should have asked himself. First, Samson didn't ask himself, what's out of control in my life? Samson didn't ask himself that question. It might seem insignificant, we may excuse it or rationalize it, maybe nobody knows about it. With most people, their lives don't just capsize, but they slowly sink because of a few leaks that they haven't been paying attention to. What's out of control in our lives? But Samson didn't ask himself that, maybe we should. Second, Samson didn't ask himself, who am I resentful about? I mean, he's killing these people 30 people because he wanted their clothes. Who is it that I can't shake my anger against? Because that simmering anger or resentment is both spiritually and physically damaging. That's what happened to Samson. And by asking ourselves that question, we can avoid it happening to us. Third, Samson didn't ask himself, who am I committed to? Samson quit taking God seriously when he was a teenager. It was a spiritual weakness that eventually bore bitter fruit in his life. But the good news is that we can learn from Samson. I think the Old Testament prodigal son, I think the Old Testament thief on the cross, because it's never too late. We learn from Samson it's never too late to turn our hearts and our lives to the God of second chances, who can take a Samson, who can take a mustard seed. And then maybe the prayers of our hearts could be like the old heritage hymn, living for Jesus. You know that one? Living for Jesus, a life that is true, striving to please him in all that I do, pledging allegiance, glad-hearted and free. This is the pathway of blessing for me. That we can do in Jesus' name. Amen.